one's belief in human nature. I've had a look at our friend, and I agree with the waterman. I think we can depend on him." The investigation required some exercise of patience at the outset. It was not till the cab had traversed the distance between Bayswater and Pimlico that the driver began to slacken his pace and look about him. After once or twice retracing its course, the vehicle entered a quiet by-street, ending in a dead wall, with a door in it, and stopped at the last house on the left-hand side, the house next to the wall. "Here it is, gentlemen," said the man, opening the cab door. Allan and Allan's adviser both got out, and both looked at the house with the same feeling of instinctive distrust. Buildings have their physiognomy, especially buildings in great cities, and the face of this house was essentially furtive in its expression. The front windows were all shut, and the front blinds were all drawn down. It looked no larger than the other houses in the street, seen in front, but it ran back deceitfully, and gained its greater accommodation by means of its greater depth. It affected to be a shop on the ground floor, but it exhibited absolutely nothing in the space that intervened between the window and an inner row of red curtains, which hid the interior entirely from view. At one side was the shop door, having more red curtains behind the glazed part of it, and bearing a brass plate on the wooden part of it, inscribed with the name of Oldershaw. On the other side was the private door, with the bell marked Professional, and another brass plate, indicating a medical occupant on this side of the house, for the name on it was Dr. Downward. If ever brick and mortar spoke yet, the brick and mortar here said plainly, "We have got our secrets inside, and we mean to keep them." "This can't be the place," said Allan. "There must be some mistake." "You know best, sir," remarked Pedgift Junior, with his sardonic gravity. "You know Mrs. Mandeville's habits." "I?" exclaimed Allan. "You may be surprised to hear it, but Mrs. Mandeville is a total stranger to me." "I'm not in the least surprised to hear it, sir. The landlady at Kingsdown Crescent informed me that Mrs. Mandeville was an old woman. Suppose we inquire," added the impenetrable Pedgift, looking at the red curtains in the shop window with a strong suspicion that Mrs. Mandeville's granddaughter might possibly be behind them. They tried the shop door first. It was locked. They rang. A lean and yellow young woman, with a tattered French novel in her hand, opened it. "Good morning, miss," said Pedgift. "Is Mrs. Mandeville at home?" The yellow young woman stared at him in astonishment. "No person of that name is known here," she answered, sharply, in a foreign accent. "Perhaps they know her at the private door," suggested Pedgift Junior. "Perhaps they do," said the yellow young woman, and shut the door in his face. "Rather a quick-tempered young person, that, sir," said Pedgift. "I congratulate Mrs. Mandeville on not being acquainted with her." He led the way, as he spoke, to Dr. Downward's side of the premises, and rang the bell. The door was opened this time by a man in a shabby livery. He, too, stared when Mrs. Mandeville's name was mentioned, and he, too, knew of no such person in the house. "Very odd," said Pedgift, appealing to Allan. "What is odd?" asked a softly stepping, softly speaking gentleman in black, suddenly appearing on the threshold of the parlour door. Pedgift Junior politely explained the circumstances, and begged to know whether he had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Downward. The doctor bowed. If the expression may be pardoned, he was one of those carefully constructed physicians in whom the public, especially the female public, implicitly trust. He had the necessary bald head, the necessary double eyeglass, the necessary black clothes, and the necessary blandness of manner, all complete. His voice was soothing, his ways were deliberate, his smile was confidential. What particular branch of his profession Dr. Downward followed was not indicated on his door-plate, but he had utterly mistaken his vocation if he was not a ladies' medical man. "Are you quite sure there is no mistake about the name?" asked the doctor, with a strong underlying anxiety in his manner. I have known very serious inconvenience to arise sometimes from mistakes about names. No, there's really no mistake. In that case, gentlemen, I can only repeat what my servant has already told you. Don't apologize, pray. Good morning." The doctor withdrew as noiselessly as he had appeared. The man in the shabby livery silently opened the door, and Allan and his companion found themselves in the street again. "Mr. Armadale," said Pedgift, "I don't know how you feel. I feel puzzled." "That's awkward," returned Allan. "I was just going to ask you what we ought to do next." "I don't like the look of the place, the look of the shopwoman, or the look of the doctor," pursued the other. "And yet I can't say I think they are deceiving us. I can't say I think they really know Mrs. Mandeville's name." The impressions of Pedgift Junior seldom misled him, and they had not misled him in this case. The caution which had dictated Mrs. Oldershaw's private removal from Bayswater was the caution which frequently overreaches itself. It had warned her to trust nobody at Pimlico with the secret of the name she had assumed as Miss Gwilt's reference. But it had entirely failed to prepare her for the emergency that had really happened. In a word, Mrs. Oldershaw had provided for everything except for the one unimaginable contingency of an after-inquiry into the character of Miss Gwilt. "We must do something," said Allan. "It seems useless to stop here." Nobody had ever yet caught Pedgift Junior at the end of his resources, and Allan failed to catch him at the end of them now. "I quite agree with you, sir," he said. "We must do something. We'll cross-examine the cabman." The cabman proved to be immovable. Charged with mistaking the place, he pointed to the empty shop window. "I don't know what you may have seen, gentlemen," he remarked, "but there's the only shop window I ever saw with nothing at all inside it. That fixed the place in my mind at the time, and I know it again when I see it." Charged with mistaking the person or the day, or the house at which he had taken the person up, the cabman proved to be still unassailable. The servant who fetched him was marked as a girl well known on the stand. The day was marked as the unluckiest working day he had since the first of the year, and the lady was marked as having had her money ready at the right moment, which not one elderly lady in 100 usually had, and having paid him his fare on demand without disputing it, which not one elderly lady in 100 usually did. "Take my number, gentlemen," concluded the cabman, "and pay me for my time, and what I've said to you, I'll swear to anywhere." Pedgift made a note in his pocket-book of the man's number. Having added to it the name of the street, and the names on the 2 brass plates, he quietly opened the cab door. "We are quite in the dark thus far," he said. "Suppose we grope our way back to the hotel?" He spoke, and looked more seriously than usual. The mere fact of Mrs. Mandeville's having changed her lodging without telling any one where she was going, and without leaving any address at which letters could be forwarded to her, which the jealous malignity of Mrs. Milroy had interpreted as being undeniably suspicious in itself, had produced no great impression on the more impartial judgment of Allan's solicitor. People frequently left their lodgings in a private manner, with perfectly producible reasons for doing so. But the appearance of the place to which the cabman persisted in declaring that he had driven Mrs. Mandeville set the character and proceedings of that mysterious lady before Pedgift Junior in a new light. His personal interest in the inquiry suddenly strengthened, and he began to feel a curiosity to know the real nature of Allan's business, which he had not felt yet. "Our next move, Mr. Armadale, is not a very easy move to see," he said, as they drove back to the hotel. "Do you think you could put me in possession of any further particulars?" Allan hesitated, and Pedgift Junior saw that he had advanced a little too far. "I mustn't force it," he thought. "I must give it time, and let it come of its own accord." "In the absence of any other information, sir," he resumed, "what do you say to my making some inquiry about that queer shop, and about those 2 names on the door-plate? My business in London, when I leave you, is of a professional nature, and I'm going into the right quarter for getting information, if it is to be got. There can't be any